But this morning, we're actually going to reach the end of Hebrews chapter 11. It's taken quite a while, and we've explored faith from many different angles, many different perspectives, through this microscopic glimpse into the lives of some remarkable Old Testament saints. And through these tableaus that were selected by the writer of Hebrews, we've seen how faith works in every circumstance of life, and it determines the choices that we make in our walk with the Lord. And really, that's... sorry, my little clicker thing seems to have stopped. That's it. Okay, working again. And again, as I was saying just now, when we look at the world and see the changes that are taking place and the way that things are going and things like that, passages such as Hebrews 11, which help us to grow in faith, are invaluable to us, because more and more in the days to come, we are going to have to walk with the feet of faith. We're going to have to learn how to operate by faith, how to live more and more by faith. And so this chapter is vital in understanding how faith has worked in the lives of other people, and how it can apply in our own lives and how it can encourage us in our own walk of faith. And as I've been preparing these messages, I've been touched by the lives of all of these people who lived so long ago. Yes, the world was very different then, and yet, in many ways, it's not so different as to be beyond our ability to recognize that the pressures and the temptations that they faced, we still face today. We're still living between the fall and the world's final redemption. And, even living on this side of the cross, we still face the pressures of a world that's hostile to God. And we find ourselves ever more swimming against the tide of things like secular humanism and anti-Semitism and many other isms that seek to mould and shape us into their man-centered ideologies. We'll pursue that line of thought a little bit later when we consider the concluding words of Hebrews 11. But I hope too that this chapter has also been a blessing, and that has stimulated you into considering your own faith, as it has with me as I've been preparing these messages. As I've said before, none of these examples were super saints. They were just regular guys like you and me, doing their best to remain faithful to God, sometimes against considerable odds, and just to be able to walk out a life of faith in partnership with God. But there's one thing that is a common thread that runs through all these examples. And the writer has mentioned it several times. And it's found again in this penultimate verse for our text for today. It's verse 39. And these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Okay, and again, we'll come back to that in a little while. This morning, we're going to consider many of the nameless, faceless saints, some of whom were involved in miraculous interventions by God, and others who demonstrated great courage and endurance in the face of intense pressure, some to the point of giving their lives in the pursuit of their faith. So, fasten your seatbelts, because it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy ride this morning. But where we eventually land, it will be glorious. So hang on in there. Okay, let's look at how the writer to Hebrews sums up his message concerning faith with these concluding words. And what more shall I say? In other words, he's saying that there's a lot more I could say. For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God was providing something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Well, there's a lot to take in there. We're not going to do it verse by verse. We're going to take little chunks at a time. But I can't read those verses without my heart being touched with a tremendous sense of awe and wonder, as I once again consider the power of faith at work in the lives of these people. These are the guys, and many like them, that we're going to be spending eternity with. And I'm so looking forward to meeting them. And when we read passages such as this, it's so humbling. All of this seems to be so far removed from our homogenized, sanitized, Western culture orientated version of faith that it almost seems unreal. And yet, this is the lot of a high percentage of our Christian brothers and sisters living in the world today. And we need to let God wound us with the reality of what the writer is setting before us today in these verses. Yes, there is great victory, but at the same time, there is also much suffering. And it all comes under the writer's desire to confront us with the reality of what a living faith really looks like. The glory and the gory reality of living and dying by faith. But I want to start this morning by taking a step back with a little bit of a reality check. And what I mean by that is that many Christians today have a distorted or a defective view of what faith really is. I would hope after our studies of this chapter that we do know, but I just want to touch on one aspect of faith that we haven't covered in this series so far. Because the purpose of preaching and teaching is to bring our views of God and his ways more and more into line with the truth. And the truth, as far as we are concerned, is the revelation of God contained in the scriptures. Jesus said in John 17:17, "Sanctify them with the truth. Your word is truth." So I want to ensure that we're all living our lives on the basis of what the Bible says about faith in a way that's clear and not distorted. I think this passage this morning is tremendously helpful in blowing away any fog of confusion concerning what real faith looks like and what kind of life that it guarantees. Because sadly, there are many who teach today that the life of faith will bring health, wealth, and prosperity. They teach that it's God's will for his children to be healed of every disease and to be rich. And there are literally hundreds of YouTube videos that are out there that promote this false teaching, often by very charismatic and very entertaining people who speak very convincingly. And they will tell you that if any of these things are lacking in your life, well, that's down to your lack of faith. And it all sounds very attractive on the front end, doesn't it? The way that it's presented, which is why so many are sucked into its ear-tickling web of deceit. But these verses that we're looking at this morning give a lie to this destructive false teaching, which is based really on a couple of verses being taken out of context and without taking the whole counsel of Scripture into consideration. So, having got that off my chest and out of the way, let's turn to our text for today. So the writer begins by saying that he could go on giving example after example of faith at work in specific individuals. But fortunately for us, he's got his eye on the clock. So now he just mentions a few names without comment. And he starts off with 4 of the judges of Israel. So that's Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. And we're not going to be looking at their stories this morning either, taking the lead from the writer of Hebrews, because time doesn't allow us to go into them all. But they're all great stories of men who lived by faith. And you can read about those 4 in the book of Judges. But then he includes a king, which is King David. And then he goes on to the prophets, beginning with Samuel. But he doesn't name any more than that, and he doesn't develop their stories, because he's made his point already. He's saying that there's no shortage of people that I could point to whose lives demonstrate faith in the living God. So he says, here's a few more names to be going on with. Go study them on your own, in your own time, and see how they lived out their lives by faith in God. And there's a cue for us too, because they all have a story of faith to tell, and they're all worth looking at to see how they lived a life of faith and what we can learn from them. It's actually very similar when we come to the book of Acts. You know, we call it the Acts of the Apostles. But actually, it's a bit that is very misleading. A more accurate title for the book would be Some Acts of Some of the Apostles, because what's recorded there is not by any means all that there was. There were other apostles who did other things, whose lives were equally crazy and adventurous, but for the sake of giving us a flavour of how the early church grew and flourished, Luke limits his account to what we have today in those 28 chapters of the book of Acts. Well, the text that we're going to look at this morning from Hebrews 11:32 to the end falls into 3 sections. Verses 32 to 35a, halfway through the verse, show how God sometimes blesses those who trust him with spectacular results. And then in verses 35b to verse 38, he completely reverses direction, showing that God sometimes blesses those who trust him with grace to endure terrible persecution without wavering. And then he concludes the chapter with verses 39 and 40, showing that God will bless all who trust him with eternal rewards. So let's begin with the first few verses. Let's just remind ourselves what they look like. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. Through faith they conquered kingdoms, they enforced justice, they obtained promises, they stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the power of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword. They were made strong out of weakness. They became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, and women received back their dead by resurrection. Well, we would love to see some of that, wouldn't we, in our lifetime? Well, first of all, the writer begins with some examples of how God works through miracles and through acts of providence when men put their faith in him. We looked at two spectacular examples of that last time, actually, didn't we? When Israel was confronted with that impenetrable barrier of the Red Sea. And then later when they were confronted with that other impossible barrier of the city of Jericho. And in both cases, God blessed Israel with miraculous response to their faith. So what we're talking about here are miraculous works of God that involve some extraordinary interruption in the normal cause-effect way that nature works. And so he mentions things like shutting the mouths of lions, which of course is a clear reference to Daniel in the lion's den. And then still in the book of Daniel, he recalls the three guys, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who were cast into that fiery furnace by Nebuchadnezzar. But they were joined there and delivered by one who looked like the Son of God. And in verse 35a, he refers to the resurrection of the son of the widow of Zarephath, raised from the dead by the faith of Elisha. So clearly, one of the ways that God responds to those who look to him with the eye of faith is to deliver them by means of a miracle. But then also, there are other times when God helps us by acts of providence. And what do I mean by that? Well, the clue is in the word providence, providence. It means God provides. It means works of God that control or intervene in situations in a less extraordinary way than a miracle. But the eye of faith sees the invisible hand of God at work in these situations. And again, this we saw last time demonstrated in the life of Rahab. She didn't perish with the rest of Jericho because she trusted the power of the God of Israel, and she showed a caring heart towards the Jewish spies. Similarly, God's providence was extended to David in his mission of conquering kingdoms and establishing righteousness in Israel. In his lifetime, he saw the hand of God working powerfully on his behalf, making him actually the most successful king that Israel ever had, and blessing Israel with the most land that they ever occupied. Well, other writers examples that the writer points us to that illustrate God's providence are Elijah, for instance, escaping the sword of Jezebel in verse 34. And then there's Gideon being strengthened when in his most vulnerable and weak moments. And I'm sure you're beginning to get the point. You know, in all of these cases, God is the one who is at work, responding to the faith of his people, sometimes with a miracle and sometimes with acts of providence. But they're all response to faith. They all come about by faith. God works through faith to do miracles and acts of providence to bring practical earthly help and deliverance to his people. Sometimes. But then, what about the second group of people? Well, let's remind ourselves what the writer to Hebrews says about them. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered. They suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. So we come to the less pleasant part of the passage, where we see the other side of the coin. And the writer lays it out very plainly, beginning with, some were tortured. And the immediate question that this throws up is, why? Why do some receive a miracle or God's providence in response to their faith, and yet others have to go through hardship and suffering and sometimes even death? And there's no easy answer. This is where we have to lean heavily on scriptures that assure us that God is for us and not against us, and that his plans for us are for good and not for evil. But we also have to remember that he is sovereign, and that everything that he does is for the purpose of bringing honor and glory to his name. You know, I've walked with God for long enough now to know that I'm convinced that when God allows us to travel on the road of hardship and suffering, he travels the road with us, and he gives us supernatural endurance and ability to persevere. And what these verses say to us is that there's no guarantee of comfort and security in this life. In all of this, we are entirely in God's hands, and he knows what's best for us. But what's also absolutely clear is that the suffering that God's people encounter in these verses comes by faith, because of faith, not because of unbelief. They're precipitated because they're walking in faith. And actually this whole sentence begins back in verse 33, which starts, who through faith. So we could start this section by saying, by faith, some were tortured, and so on. All the suffering and all the hardship is received and endured by faith. So let me say it this way. Having faith is not the determining factor in whether we suffer or escape. God is. It's all down to God's sovereign will, expressing his wisdom and his love. And that I find immensely comforting. It's really a great relief to know that there is a greater explanation for my pain or my pleasure than whether or not I have enough faith. To beat yourself up because you think your suffering's down to a lack of faith, or a lack of faith on your part, is both unbiblical and completely contrary to God's purposes being worked out in your life. Now, I'm not going to go into a detailed catalogue on these verses because they speak for themselves. But what I will say is that as we draw closer to the end of the age, the reality of these verses will become more and more the experience of the people of God. Now, we've spoken before about things like the rise of the harlot Babylon in the end times. Harlot Babylon is outlined in the book of Revelation. You particularly read about it in chapters 17 and 18. And harlot Babylon will be a conglomeration of humanism, religion, false justice, economic systems, and trading cartels, all working together to provide a framework that everyone will be expected to live by. And it will be marked by an intense hatred for those who do not comply with its rigorous constraints, and especially the people of God, because it will be the absolute antithesis of everything that we stand for. Revelation 17 verse 6 tells us that the woman personified as the harlot Babylon was drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. So these are the two realities that face the saints in the days to come. Now, I'm sure that we would all much rather sign up to be in the first group where there is miraculous deliverance. And believe me, in the end times, there will be more miraculous activity than in the book of Exodus and the book of Acts put together. But the reality is that there will also be many in the second group who will face hardship and martyrdom because of their commitment to Jesus. And don't forget, the writer of Hebrews is also addressing a group of people who were just beginning to experience intense persecution at the hands of the Roman authorities. And what the writer is doing here is preparing them and us so that when the pressure comes, they and us will not be caught unawares. And if taking so much time to study these examples of faith in Hebrews 11 has taught us one thing, one main thing, I would say it's this: faith loves God more than life itself. So, if you find yourself at some time in the future facing torture or even death, does faith say, if God loved me, he would get me out of this? No. Faith believes that there is something far better beyond the immediate situation. Faith believes that there is a resurrection for believers that is even better than the miracle of escape. The eye of faith sees the glory of the resurrection that transcends the glory of miraculous deliverance. And it's that faith that strengthens and sustains us through the hardest and the most difficult circumstances of life. It's faith that's forged in the understanding of who we are in Christ, what we mean to him, and why in the days to come we will face such rejection and opposition. You know, the writer to Hebrews is not saying anything new here. He's illustrating in a very graphic way the reality of the warning that Jesus gives us in John 15. And in John 15 verses 18 to 21 he says this: "If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me." Hard words, aren't they? But Jesus wants us to be prepared. That's why he's given us scriptures like this, so that we are prepared in our hearts. And if Jesus wants us to be aware of the kind of thing that the writer to Hebrew tells us all about here, that it will be a distinct possibility for all of us who name the name of Jesus at the end of the age to go through these things, to experience these things. But at the same time, we can draw much courage and comfort from all that we've learnt from Hebrews 11, which has been included in our Bibles in order to strengthen us in our faith. The great challenge of this chapter, in fact, it's the same for the whole of the book of Hebrews, is for our lives to be lived with a death-defying passion for God. And this comes by cultivating a deep and a satisfying relationship with God, that we rest in him whether living or dying, whether comfortable or suffering. So we aim to cultivate this unshakable confidence that God is better than what life can give us or what death can take from us. Now in verse 38, the writer inserts a little comment. He says, "of whom the world is not worthy." In other words, he's stating heaven's perspective on these people. You see, the world's assessment of these saints is that they're worthless, only fit to be mistreated and hated and rejected. So their refusal to conform to the world's fallen standards means the world eliminated them and their witness. But in heaven, they're honoured. Their true worth is recognised and it's rewarded. The word worthy in the Greek literally means the tipping of the scales. In other words, their true worth is recognised. And so, by the value system with which men on earth measure one another, these people didn't make the grade. They were found wanting. They were not weighty enough to be found acceptable. But in heaven, their lives carried the full weight of glory that caused the scales to tip. There's an eternal weight of glory that will only be ours in the resurrection. Their glory and their integrity shine forth in the more brilliantly, all the more brilliantly against the world's darkness and hatred. Their lives may have been cut short, but their testimony will resound throughout the heavens for eternity. But the next little section, the last two verses of Hebrews 11 says this: "And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had promised something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect." It took me a little while to get my head round those words and what they're actually saying, all right? Because the writer now makes one last statement that encompasses all of those mentioned in this chapter, whether specifically by name or as one of the nameless, faceless ones in his summary at the end. He says, they were all commended for their faith, all the faithful, all the known and the unknown, the famously triumphant and those who anonymously persevered in their suffering. They were all commended for their faith. Faith pleases God, and he neither forgets nor fails to reward those who make room for faith in their lives. But you know, there's one further common factor that the writer mentions, and that is that none of them received what was promised. And if you follow through on their stories and study them in detail, you find that actually many of them did receive promises that were fulfilled in their lifetimes. But they didn't receive the one promise that they were all looking for. And to see what it is, we have to go back to Genesis chapter 3. And this is what Genesis 3:15 says. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." This is speaking about the promise that they never received. They never received the promise of a deliverer, a redeemer, the Messiah, the promise of a covenant that could bring perfection, the promise of a salvation that could bring men into God's presence totally and fully. None of them received that. They were all under the old covenant. So they only saw the fulfillment of this promise from afar, in types and in shadows. True faith has the courage to count on salvation. These faithful saints had to live in hope. They knew very little about the nature or the time or the means of God's salvation. But they knew it was coming. And this was the basis of their faith and their trust. They had abiding confidence that one day God would do the necessary thing to redeem them and to reward them. And what happened to them before that was not consequential. They didn't receive what was promised, but they gained approval through their faith. Their faith was not in some immediate fulfillment, but in the ultimate fulfillment of the promise. And here is where faith is most tested and where it most matters. Why didn't they receive what was promised? Well, the writer gives us the answer in the last verse. God has provided something better for us, and that something better is the new covenant in Jesus' blood. Now remember, the old covenant could never take away the sins of the people or give them a clean conscience. The blood of bulls and goats can never take away sins. And so they never found the promise of the old covenant because it was never there. They never found full access to God or the freedom of conscience that comes with complete forgiveness. They had to continue making sacrifices over and over and over again. And so God provided a better thing for us, so that without us, they would not be made perfect. In other words, their perfection had to wait for us. They had to wait for the coming of the new covenant, and the cross is where we meet. They live their lives looking forward to the cross. We live our lives looking back to the cross. The new covenant in Jesus' blood unites our faith with theirs. And the author's point is this: if all these Old Testament saints were faithful through all of these trials, even though they didn't receive the promise of Messiah in the flesh, how much more should we be faithful, since we know Jesus and we have the indwelling Spirit? And yet, there's something more. Although we have the promise of Jesus and the joy of knowing him and the fellowship of, and we have fellowship with him and partnership with him right now, we don't yet have the full experience of the glory that's going to be revealed when he comes to establish his kingdom and ultimately bring heaven to earth. And so, like these saints of old, we too live by faith in God's promise as we await the final consummation when Jesus returns. Until then, we must patiently endure all that comes our way, both good and bad, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. Well, we've come to the end of our journey through Hebrews chapter 11, but we've still got 2 chapters to go before we finish the book, and there are still some great passages to explore together. But I want to sum up where we've been today in a way that is like a kind of microcosm of the whole chapter, with 3 summary statements that are going to help us to grow in faith. First, faith is ready to sacrifice present comfort for future reward. Faith recognizes that this life is very short compared to eternity. Getting all this into perspective is foundational to cultivating a mindset that sees suffering and endurance as a gateway to an eternity where there is no pain or tears or sadness. And this helps us to endure the momentary light afflictions that we encounter with a positive attitude where, as Paul says, we're able to rejoice in our sufferings because they produce in us endurance, character, and hope. Secondly, faith lives with a focus on God, not a focus on people or things. All the saints mentioned in chapter 11 could endure mockings, scourgings, imprisonments, and even death because their focus was on God and what he had promised. They were looking to eternity, not to the vapor that is life here in this short-term dwelling on the earth. If God fills our vision, there's no room for anything else. And as we turn our eyes on him, the things of earth grow strangely dim. And then thirdly, faith trusts and obeys God, leaving the results to his sovereignty. To some, God grants deliverance by spectacular miracles. To others, he enables them to face tests and trials in his strength. The difference is not in the people or in their level of faith, but in the sovereignty of God and his purposes in each situation. We know the same God that these Old Testament saints knew. In fact, we have even more because we know Jesus personally. In summing up our journey through Hebrews 11, I think the writer has given us some very solid guidance regarding how faith works in the life of the believer. And I hope that it's done something to increase your own personal level of faith and your understanding of how faith can change the way that we live today. Faith gives us a foundation for life. It helps us to make decisions about what are the important things and the priorities to pursue, guiding us through the contours of life in the 21st century. Sometimes faith will confront us with stark realities, choices that have to be made, often on the spur of the moment. But having read and digested these stories of Old Testament saints pressing in to live a life of faith in their generation, we find that our own faith connects us with a long tradition and heritage of the faithful who have gone before us. And that means we are now better equipped to face the pressures and the challenges of walking out our life of faith today. And it's been worth it, well worth it. It puts us in a position where we are better able to please God. Jesus often asks questions to make a point. I want to leave you today with a very relevant question that Jesus asked in Luke 18. It's a question that relates to the end of the age, but its response in our hearts is timeless. And he says in Luke 18 verse 8, "Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?"